So the final session today is probably the one most anticipated by the community because we're remembering the events of last year, particularly this weekend last year. And it's also been one of the most difficult sessions to put together because everyone here touches on this subject in some way. Luckily for me, I'm thrilled by the panel that was put together and that focuses on the floods of 2016 in Acadiana. The credit for this panel lies largely in the hands of one of its panelists, Kim Goodell of Watermark Alliance, who organized this panel to focus exclusively on the impact of the floods in this region in particular. Kim Goodell is the founder of Watermark Alliance. Watermark Alliance was established as a public interest organization with a single focus on protection and conservation of water and relative public trust issues. Central to Watermark's mission is a drive to align community, industry, government, and academia to develop policy and practices necessary to protect and conserve all water resources for future generations. After establishing a successful 24-year career in oil and gas E&P, Goodell retired in 2005, starting Watermark Alliance in her retirement. Goodell is committed to the pursuit of her passion, advocacy for water, which she calls the essential element of life. Next up is Guy Cormier, who's serving his 5th term as an elected official of St. Martin Parish government. He served as a council member his 1st term, and for the remaining 4 terms, he was elected as parish president, which he was serving as when the 2016 floods impacted the region. He is also currently serving as immediate past president for the Police Jury Association of Louisiana. He is the graduate of St. Martinville Senior High and a graduate of Teche Area Community College. He also attended the University of Southwestern Louisiana, where he majored in industrial technology. After working in the sugar industry for 5 years, he entered the private business world and still serves as the vice president of Keystone Machine Works Incorporated. A lifelong resident of St. Martinville, he has always been active in his community and his parish. He was named the 2003 Business Leader of the Year by the St. Martinville Chamber of Commerce. He is a member of the St. Martinville Chamber of Commerce, Brobridge Chamber of Commerce, Civitan Club, St. Martin Rotary Club, and Kiwanis. He has served as a board of director for the St. Martin Council on Aging, United Way of Acadiana, and Ducks Unlimited. He is currently serving as a vice chairman of the Acadiana Planning Commission, vice chairman of the Acadiana Area Metropolitan Organization, and is a member of the St. Martin Hospital Board of Directors. Pamela Gonzalez Granger holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Civil Engineering and a Master of Science in Engineering from the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. Granger has over 23 years of experience in modeling, design, master planning, project management, permitting, construction administration, and marketing for drainage, roadway, utilities, site, civil reservoirs, levees, dams, and coastal projects in Louisiana. Florida, Texas, California, Massachusetts, and is a licensed professional civil engineer in Louisiana and Florida. That's a long list. Granger is the owner and president of McVade Engineers and Consultants, LLC, a woman-owned civil engineering firm located in Youngsville, Louisiana. Granger specializes in water resources planning and design and implementation of small civil engineering projects, as well as large civil works and coastal restoration projects throughout the Gulf Coast. Ahmad Habib is an endowed chair and professor in the Civil Engineering Department at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. He also serves as the director for the Center for Water Systems Research and is the associate director of the Institute for Coastal and Water Research. Habib received the 2016 University Distinguished Professor Award and the 2011 College of Engineering Researcher of the Year. His research expertise is in surface hydrology with focus on precipitation estimation and analysis, hydrologic modeling, flood prediction, and water resource management, as well as coastal restoration. Habib has published more than 50 peer-reviewed journal articles, 5 book chapters, and several conference papers. He received several awards, including the Best Journal Award at the Watershed Excellence Award for the American Society for Civil Engineers. He also served on the Precipitation Committee of the American Geophysical Union, the Education Committee of the Consortium of Universities for Advancement of Hydrologic Sciences, Incorporated, and the Environmental Water Resources Institute Task Committee on the use and application of NWS Doppler radar. Habib is a professional engineer registered in the states of Louisiana and Texas. Last but not least is Mark DeBrock, who was appointed Director of LCG Public Works Department effective July 17th. DeBrock brings 30 years of experience as a civil engineer, along with an impressive portfolio of public and private projects across the full range of disciplines. He has an extensive and varied professional background, including drainage, roadway and bridge design, commercial and residential development, and structural design, as well as solid waste transfer facilities and site planning. He has worked as a principal engineer with DeBrock Engineering Incorporated since its founding in 1994, serving as president since 2014, and as vice president of operations, chief financial officer, and as a project manager prior to that. Through these various roles, DeBrock has considerable experience in administration and management of technical personnel, corporate accounting, and technology. He holds a bachelor's degree in civil engineering from Louisiana State University and is a lifelong resident of Lafayette. And with that, I'm going to turn this panel over to the person who put it together, and our first speaker, Kim Goodell of Watermark Alliance.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Liz, for putting this program together. It's a little sobering after seeing the documentary and following the documentary, the situation that we have here in Acadiana. I don't think the remedy, comes close to what's needed in other parts of Louisiana, but they are critical to us. Just with the industry that we have here, the seafood industry, the aquaculture, the oil and gas industry, everything is dependent on really the nation, serving the nation, extending to the nation. So anyway, I'll start just with a little bit about Watermark Alliance. As Liz mentioned, it's a public interest, community-based organization. It's for our community. It's focused on water and public trust issues, the outreach, and the interface is across the community. It includes business and industry, as well as government and academia. Water is the essential element for life. It's our most sacred resource. We protect and conserve what we hold sacred. Louisiana's Constitution, Article 9, Section 1, places the responsibility on government to protect and conserve our water, all of our resources for that matter. And it reads, if you see the bookmark that they've placed on your seats in front of you, the natural resources of the state, including air and water, and the healthful, scenic, historic, and aesthetic quality of the environment shall be protected, conserved, and replenished insofar as possible, and consistent with the health, safety, and welfare of the people. The Supreme Court has interpreted that to mean that our government should be proactive and just not reactive. Central to our mission is a drive to align community, business and industry, government, and academia to ensure our rich water resources remain for many future generations. We all have the moral obligation to collaborate and do our part. We all have a moral obligation to honestly assess our impact on the environment. We all have a responsibility to set policy, whether it's personal, corporate, or government policy, to ensure that the built environment does not rule to the point of destruction. Good policy and good legislation must be based in science. Internally, regulators refer to this as real E. What are the real environmental impacts? If we are not thorough with identifying the real E, our ultimate decisions regarding policy, laws, regulations, as well as our business decisions will be flawed. It takes leadership in all four of these sectors working together to resolve and mitigate the risks and threats to our environment today. And it takes the decisions to be based in science. So the alignment starts with community that truly appreciates that water is our most sacred resource, the essential element for life, and that we protect and conserve that which we hold sacred. Understanding the threats and the relationship between the built environment and the natural environment, the real E science is key. Watermark works with communities and interfaces with industry, government, and academia to foster that good legislation and policy making. When Liz asked me to put a panel together for the 2016 flood, I knew almost immediately who I thought should be part of it. These are all folks in our immediate area, Acadiana, and they've all been working very hard to coordinate and to interface amongst community, the environmental sector, as well as the community at large. They interface with government to different extents, and they're all devoted to addressing the flood issue here in the Acadiana area. The first person that I'm going to call up is Parish President of St. Martin, Guy Cormier. Guy Cormier grew up in St. Martin. The major economy there is aquaculture and agriculture, seafood, crawfish, and sugarcane. That understanding of the natural forces that threaten are exactly what we're trying to address today, those same threats. Guy has hands-on experience, lifelong living and understanding these issues. He also brings position and clout with the legislators, as well as being appointed to the Water Resource Commission. That's the commission that has been charged with coming up with a water code to govern the supply and demand of our water and across the state. Guy is dedicated to really working, bringing together all of the 9 municipalities that are included in our watershed. When I talk about the watershed, I'm talking specifically about the Teche, Vermilion, Mermentau watershed. Last week, our governor came to Lafayette to kick off what he is calling, in conjunction with FEMA, they are kicking off what they are referring to as a pilot program, Resilient Recovery. This is something that has probably been talked about quite a bit in other areas, but we feel it's, or in conjunction with FEMA and the government, they've decided that our state government, that the best way to approach the remedies to prevent this from happening again in this area is to study our watersheds, what makes up our watersheds, what threatens our watersheds, and that is the approach that they're using. Guy is going to talk about that approach, but he will kick off the panel talking about, first talking about the first red flag to go up. Guy?
I'm going to use a wireless mic if you don't mind. She said I just need to turn it on. Check 1, 2. Can you hear me? Yes. First off, let me just say thanks for inviting me to come, Kim. I'm very humbled to be a part of this panel. If you didn't, I'm sure you caught it. The 3 people behind that sit with me on this panel have an abundance of years of experience in engineering, and for me to just be a little Cajun boy from St. Martin Parish, to be standing up here to be talking to you about something so specific and so dedicated and so important to this community, I'm very humbled to be able to be here. If I had the choice, I would say that I probably didn't want to be the parish president in 2016 because of what we had to experience. But for whatever reason, I think God led me to be in that position, and here I am today. I guess before you find out where we are, you got to find out where you started, right? So just a quick synopsis of the Acadiana floods last year, because I know we have people from all over here, and you may be thinking to yourself, well, what exactly happened in Acadiana that was so traumatic? One of the largest natural disasters we've ever experienced here in our region, and I'm talking about with hurricanes and everything included. Most floodwaters we had seen since probably 1940, and maybe even beyond that. Some calling it a 500-year flood, some calling it a 1,000-year event, depending upon who you talk to. But it was a rainfall that happened over a period of more so 24 hours, but in our case, we had rain for like 5 days that totaled, in some areas of our parish, 31 inches. And you learn very quickly about your issues when you have a significant rainfall like that. I'm not here to stand up and tell you that when we're going to all finish talking that we have remedies for a situation like that, because 31 inches of rain, in my case, in a matter of 5 days, there's not a system that's built to be able to handle that. But what we want to do is maybe try to see if we can figure out a way that we can start adapting to and controlling some of these 6, 8, 10, 12-inch rains that are being more common in our area. And we're seeing water go in areas that we've never seen go before. We're trying to figure out what it is that we can do to probably prevent that from happening. Just to kind of give you an idea, I know I mentioned 1,000-year events and 500-year events. I've been in government 18 years, and I've seen 400-year rain events. So I don't know if that tells you how old I am, but I should be 450 years old because I've seen 400-year events. At the end of the day, though, we've seen significant rainfall last year that got us here today. And so just kind of back up to tell you a little bit about how it happened. So we all woke up one morning very early. I'm a guy, and I'll tell you my personal story. I'm a guy that goes to the gym every morning at 4 o'clock. I'm usually at the gym for 4. But on that particular day, we had a boot camp class that started at 5. So I took my time getting there, but I went and run a little bit early. And or I thought I was going to run a little bit early, and the rain was falling. And I said, it seems like it's raining pretty hard. I'd watched the news the night before, and our local guy, Rob Perillo, who a lot of people watch, that's who I'm faithful to. I used to be Dick Farrow, but Dick's gone now. So Rob had kind of forecast that we're going to have 5 to 6 inches of heavy rain in some parts, but it was going to come down probably fast. And the National Weather Service was saying that as well. But Rob, before he signed off that night, said, but if this sheer wind stops here, we could have the potential to have rain for a whole day. And I hung on to that. And the next morning when I woke up, it was raining. I said, man, I hope Rob was wrong and that this thing is just it's moving through quickly. Didn't take very long. We started our boot camp at 5 o'clock. By 6 a.m., we had water coming in the building that we do boot camp in. So our instructor said, it's time for y'all to get in your vehicles to go home. So I tried to rush home. When I got in my truck, my phone was already blowing up. Some of my council members were calling me and saying, is this crazy? But they got water on such and such a road. We got to close it. And so we started working. By 7 a.m., I normally would bring my nephew to school in the morning. I took off. He goes to school in Lafayette, so I took off like I would be going every Friday morning to bring him to school. And I got turned around at the Broussard exit. And the reason why I got turned around, I had pulled up on a state highway that's normally out of the water, and I could just see the middle of the windows of a small car that was floating in the middle of the street. And that's when I said, this is going to be really bad. Turned around, went home, dropped him off. Of course, they canceled school everywhere. And it started us on a journey that I will never forget. First 24 hours or so, we had a tremendous amount of flash flooding. This event caused two different types of floods. It was categorized as the flood of 2016. But you had flash flooding that happened within the first couple days, or really the first day. That's a lot of rain falling in a short period of time, and the system can't handle it. And then we had what I got most of is backwater flooding because of the topography of the land in which I serve and the water coming from other parishes to stack up on me. We had water in our parish for 38 days after the event. It wasn't 24 hours afterwards. I got a phone call from a gentleman who I don't represent, but a caring guy in our community. And I say community because I'm from Acadiana. And just like water doesn't recognize parish boundaries, I don't as well. Although I serve St. Martin Parish, I'm always worried about what's going on throughout Acadiana. A guy by the name of Harold Shuffler, who's with us today. I want you to stand up, Mr. Harold, really quick, if you don't mind, just so that people can see who you are. Mr. Harold called me and said, Mr. Cormier, and we go way back. We worked on multiple issues together. He said, I'm seeing the Vermilion River flow north faster than I've ever seen it flow north, and you're going to have some issues. And I said, man, I've seen it flow north before, but not this fast. So I always go to the same little bridge that I can check to make sure that the water's supposed to be flowing south, but it was flowing north, but at a rapid pace. And it didn't take me long to figure out that we were going to have some major issues. And so I called him back and said, you're right, it's coming, and you know, I've never seen this before. And keep in mind that it's still raining, and it's still raining, and it's still raining. And so I went back to my office and said, I had to sit down with myself and say, okay, there's some things I can control, but I can't control this baby. Mother Nature is just dumping it on me. But I got to do my best to document what I'm seeing so that in years to come, if this ever happens again, I won't be there, hopefully, but somebody else will see it. And I started just kind of chronologically documenting things as they came forward, at least in my parish. It didn't take me very long, probably 2 or 3 days, to call Mr. Harold back and say, I think this is more than a St. Martin Parish problem. This is probably more of a Acadiana problem. And coincidentally, and I think it's just the good Lord lining me up where I need to be, I had a personal relationship with every police, jury, or parish president in our region, in the Vermilion watershed specifically. And so I picked up the phone and called all of them, and I said, I want to put together a meeting so that we can start discussing from a regional perspective how we handle this moving forward. Because this water does not know where the parish line is. I'm recognizing that very quickly. I got 100% response, called a meeting in my office. Rain event was on August 12th. Gave them a week or so to get there, or a couple weeks to get there. I think the meeting was on September 5th or 6th, where I thought we were going to have 15 people. We had 85 people. People who were just concerned about what it is we needed to do moving forward. I still had water in my parish. This was less than 20, this is 22 days after the event. People were driving into my parish to come to this meeting, passing on highways that had water butted up to the side of it. And so it started this regional conversation, which pretty much brings us here today as a panel to talk to you. I'm not going to take full credit for that. I think Mr. Harrell probably would, if I had to give credit to one person, it's probably him, because he said, I think you need to take a guy and run with it, because nobody else will. And I took, if somebody tells me to take the ball and run with it, I'm running with it. So I took it and started running with it, and we soon found out that although it didn't affect Evangeline and maybe Acadia Parish as much as it did in our areas, as much, it affected them, but not as much, they were just as concerned about what was going on below them, because water has to flow south. And if we can't correct problems on the south end, there's no use doing any work on the north end. So we got full cooperation from a group of guys and ladies and said, let's start talking about this from a regional perspective. And we've been trudging along that way since. Ms. Kim made a comment earlier about the governor was here last week, announced $25 million for the Vermilion watershed to be able to put money towards a watershed that needs to be spent wisely to mitigate possibly this happening again. Let me tell you how important it was for us to be working together. Just today, I checked with the governor's office to find out what other regions got. The AMED-COMED area issued $2 million. The North Louisiana area that flooded in March of last year got $1.8 million. The area around Livingston and Ascension Parish, $1.5 million. We got $25 million. And when I asked the governor Saturday, because he spent the afternoon here surveying the damages or the repairs from the damages that were experienced last fall, why so much in our area? And he said, because you're working together. And I think it's time for us, not only just in Acadiana, but in this whole state to start working together, because all these watersheds connect to another watershed. And are they all just as important as the one that we're working on right now? There's a lot to be done moving forward. And again, I have a panel of talent here. But I want to at least introduce the next speaker, because she's been involved from day one. She was one of the first people I called, who coincidentally had started working with the Corps to do a study of a portion of the Vermilion watershed in the Youngsville area. That's an area that was very hard hit. I can sit here and say that, and we were, if you got an inch of water in your house, or you got 3 foot of water in your house, or 5 foot of water in your house, you got water, and nobody wants to have that. I look toward my neighbors in the east, and I see that, around Denham Springs and all that, they still trying to rebuild. I mean, terrible what happened to them. But I got to at least concentrate my efforts on here. And this next lady was important in trying to at least get us to start talking about what it is that we need to do. And a lot of this has to be planned. We made a decision as a group of parish presidents that we would take this $25 million and we would try to come up with a way to spend it where we can all agree on it. Because I made a comment at a meeting, and I mean this. And politically, I'll probably get criticized for this, but I don't care, because this is the right thing to do. That if the governor wanted to give me $5 million because I experienced flooding in the 2016 flood, I would much rather take the $5 million and spend it in Lafayette Parish if that's where the problem is. Because if you look at, we consider it a Bayou Teche parish. And if you look at the Bayou Teche, the way it's formed, it snakes through the top of my parish and dumps at the bottom. 90% of the water on the west side of the Bayou Teche has to dump into the Vermilion system, but it has to make its way through Lafayette. And when I made that comment, I think it gave everybody a sense of urgency to say, why can't we just look at it from just a regional perspective? And if we all agree that the money needs to be spent in Vermilion Parish, but it helps all of us, let's do that. And from what I was told, that has never been done before in this area. Pam has helped us get there. So Ms. Pam Granger, who's an engineer who's helping us trudge along through this, it'll be our next presenter, and I'd just like to introduce her.
Thank you, Guy. Can you guys hear me? I talk pretty loud, and some of you may have wondered why I would be up here. And if you ask Mark Dubrock, he said it's because I like to talk. So if you have a speaking engagement, Mark will give me credit that I do like to talk. I am extremely passionate with regards to water resources. In 2003, I changed my career to mainly focus on water resources. For a very long time, I actually left the area and worked in some states, as my introduction talked about, Florida and Texas and California and all up the Northeast. And they do a lot of different things for watershed management. And when I moved back here in 2010, one of the things that I was very passionate was to try to bring some of those best practices, some of those ideas back here to a place that I love so much. And I started working with the Corps of Engineers back in 2014 to try to get some funding to come to this way, to start looking and planning and getting some additional modeling and science. It's kind of like I was talking drainage when drainage wasn't cool at that point. Unfortunately, my efforts didn't happen quick enough, but I am happy that we are doing a lot, because myself included, I was someone who was flooded and still, trying to get everything back together. But through all of that, this was the most important thing, is to keep the science and the working relationship between everybody regionally. So my presentation, I have just a couple of slides here, and I talk, even though it said the August 2016 flood, I talk about beyond the floods. I think everybody knows, if you average it out, anywhere from 28 inches, maybe more, some in 36 hours, some in 24 hours, but regardless of which event, it's a larger event. It's a larger event than anything that we manage or that we design for, and I'm not going to say that that's something we're going to design for. It's something we want to reduce the risk of, and that's the goal, is to reduce the risk of the larger events and to manage the smaller events. And we know that our area has experienced some rapid growth, some areas a little bit more than others, and we've traditionally had more of a local approach. And of course, for those people, it's not just about quantity, it's about quality. But if we're not managing our quantity, we can have a water quality issue. We do have, you can have additional runoff. You're going to have additional runoff, but you can have erosion. You will, with rapid growth and construction, you have debris. So if you have rising waters, that debris goes out to some of our streams. And then when you have a tax system, you also have a water quality where you can't recharge, you can't get rid of some of the phosphorus or nitrogen that you could get if you actually allow systems to detain. Flooding not only leads to residential and commercial property damage, which is what we see a lot of, but it's also loss of work, business. Even on our local, some of the ones that are flash floods, sometimes we have a little bit longer. If we have to close schools or we have to close roads, and we're not moving goods and services, people are leaving work to go pick up their kids from school, that really affects the economy. It affects economic development, not only from those days, not only from the large events, but also for if businesses want to come. If they know that there may be some impacts, they may or may not want to come to our area. And then again, you also have the water quality impacts, and then damage to infrastructure. In particular, we have a lot of roadways that are asphalt, and everybody knows asphalt doesn't like water. So there's also that to think about, that if we can lower our water levels and manage it a little bit better, our infrastructure may have a longer lifespan. There are a lot of impacts. There's not one thing that caused any of the flooding that we had or any of the localized. There are several issues. Some are compounded. We've heard a lot of talk about, okay, well, this hasn't been cleaned or that. Well, some of it is because we can't get to it. Some of it's about access. It's about authority, who has the authority to do it. We also have design criteria. Well, we have different areas have different criteria. Again, we're a local approach for the most part in the past. And so that different criteria, we're not necessarily or have not been on the same page. And so you have high development in some areas, and you may not have the most stringent requirements in those same areas. We talked about how we had a lot of farming and a lot of ag business. We have a lot of our roads, which we may be using more like an arterial now. That was a local road years ago, and that culvert system is not made for the amount of traffic you would normally have. So if it closes, it has a higher impact. But usually the more traffic, if you have a different designation of the road, you design that cross drain for a different storm event. So sometimes our lower storm events impact a road that is very critical to moving goods and services and people. And then we have private drainage. There's a lot of people. I think we need to do a lot of public education. Not many people know what the swale is that was in the back of their yards that they decide that they're going to fill in, or that there are certain things that are their maintenance as well. So, and if we had a regional approach, and if we had a lot more public involvement, there's a lot of things that are some low-hanging fruit that we can do, again, to reduce our risk and reduce some of the flooding we've had. The benefits of watershed management, and I'm going to say that, I'm not talking just drainage design, I'm talking watershed management. We can reduce flood risk. Again, we're not going to say flood prevention, you say risk reduction. Because flood prevention gives people a whole different security that we may or may not be able to provide. We can reduce infrastructure damage and, of course, increase economic development, water quality. If we can do a lot more, we need to manage our erosion and sediment control. That's something that takes a lot of inspection and enforcement. With rapid growth, we don't always get to do that. Aquifer recharge. I mean, again, if we're sending our water, if everyone wants to do subsurface and concrete lined, we're not giving our aquifers chance to recharge like we can if we do detention and use green infrastructure and low impact development techniques. And of course, you can also have a lot of benefits with regards to nitrogen and phosphorus if your detention systems are designed to have a certain residence time. And by that, we can create more resilient communities. What we have to do, and these gentlemen behind me are the ones that are going to be part of, they're part of the solution, and they understand, and that's what makes it easy, is that they get it, is that it's a balance. We have primary systems and we have major systems, and oftentimes people don't realize that there's a difference in what you design them for and a difference in the expectations. But what we have to do is we have to balance. We have to balance what we do on our primary systems to be able to handle the localized flooding, but also our major systems with regards to our larger storms. There's a lot of research that shows that if a major system is properly planned, then the 100-year event would be minimal. But if it's unplanned or improperly managed, then you're going to have damage throughout the watershed. And also, if we can detain and manage on the 25-year, we can reduce and provide some protection for the 100-year event. If you manage quantity, then a lot of quality benefits will follow. We can use green versus gray solutions, and I say that in that not every solution is going to be concrete line a channel, change this bridge section, add this culvert. There's a lot of other solutions that will help and that will benefit not only quantity, but I know a lot of folks, we often wonder about the quality with regards to all of the development that we're doing. And again, in response to what the governor said, let's lower the base flood elevations. That'll in turn help with the cost of flood insurance. That helps with the cost of development. Let's not continue to raise the base flood elevation and raise houses. We can, I think the message that I've always said is that we can develop and live with water. We can manage our water, and again, it's not just drainage design, we have to manage our water. We have to look at it regionally. As Guy said, water does not know political boundaries, and in the states who have been very effective in managing their water and having high development, that's what they've done. They've done a watershed approach, a regional approach to their, actually to development regulations. We need the models and the data, the applied science to support decisions. Just like Guy said, he's documenting some of the things. We have a tendency to use a lot of national data. But it would be really good, we have a lot of data locally, to start using those as we are coming up with our solutions. Manage the data that we have, our rainfall, what we've seen, rather than just what's been seen on a national level. Best management practices, we have not been, there's lots of states that have best management practices, again, that's used throughout a state or throughout a watershed. That's something that we haven't done here. And again, I think that would be something that would be part of that group's decision, is to try to look at some best management practices that everybody implements equally. Public outreach, education, involvement. I really think there's a large role that the public plays, not only in identifying, but working on the solutions and being a part of the solutions. And regulation and policy, again, that's above my pay grade. But there's a lot of regulations and policy, again, if it was done on a watershed approach and not just on a smaller political boundary, would go a long way to us being able to develop and live with water. Moving forward, as Guy mentioned, some of the things that have been discussed is to look and develop that watershed management framework. and they would have, the different parish presidents working not only with the stakeholders and with the university and consultants and internal agency engineers, is to come up, what are those policies and requirements that helps the watershed as a whole? What are those best management practices? And then build that upon the applied science and be able to have the models and the calculations that back it, but also the predictability and the models that help us on a warning system for those things that we can't necessarily provide 100% protection from. Also, we're looking at developing that river and those watershed models. I know there's going to be a lot. Mark will be able to talk, I'm sure, a lot about channel cleaning, channel maintenance, regional detention, and things. I mean, things that lots of people have lots of ideas, but a lot of it has to be done in a certain order and in a certain area for it to provide the most benefit. So know that those things are coming, but it's going to be something that's going to take a while so that those are put in the right place and the dollars are spent the right way. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Habib, I believe. That way he can, Dr. Habib's got a lot of experience with regards to the applied science, and I think that he can talk a little bit more about some of the ideas and things that the university is working on with that regards.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for the sitting for the panel, and I appreciate the opportunity, Liz and Kim, for inviting me to come and share some of my own perspectives. I call it I'm a hydrologist by training. I'm a civil engineer, and I work with precipitation, floods, and all what's in between. And today I'm going to share with you some of my own engineering, insights into the flood that happened in 2016, and also some of the personal experiences that I developed, and I appreciate living through this flood with the community here. So I have quite a few slides. I'll browse through them quickly and hopefully leave time for the rest of the panel and questions. But I guess, like I said, it has been a very personal experience for me. This is what I saw when I, at the 2 days after the rainfall, when I opened my front door, this was the scene in my own subdivision. And, I've never seen anything like that. I lived here not too long, but since 2003, I guess. So, I've never seen my street like that. So, and I had a lot of discussions at that time with many of my colleagues and my friends and neighbors on, what's happening, and, is this a 1,000-year storm? Is this a 500-year storm, or what have you? And, I'm going to share some of those with you as we go through the presentation. What struck me the most is the amount of confusion that people had, including myself and the neighbors and the friends, on what's going on. And, I'm sure you probably have asked these questions, or you have heard them from your neighbors or the community. We are in a flood zone. Why did we didn't get flooded? So why did I have to pay for all this insurance? Or we are not in a flood zone, but we got flooded. What's going on? The science is bad, or the maps, or what kind of storm is that, and so forth. And some of the insights that I'm going to share with you today are probably not going to answer these questions, but will help us understand, what are the missing pieces, especially when it comes to communicating with the public. What are the scientific, studies that we are doing, and the numbers that we communicate with the public on, what type of storm it is, and why it's flooding or why it's not flooding, and how that relates to how we build our communities and make decisions in development. So, but before we get into this, I'll go over a very quick overview of what happened in the storm. So I guess I can move with this. Right. So just a quick overview, and I think some of the previous panelists talked about how much rainfall we got. And, this is a map, probably have seen it before, that shows the total rainfall amounts over, the area that was affected by the floods. And you can see right there, this is about 48 hours of rainfall, the worst case, So this is basically running through the 3 or 4 days and adding up the rain and looking for what's the worst of the storm during those 48 hours. And some areas here, you can see the worst hit areas were in East Baton Rouge and south of Lafayette here. And some numbers were in the order of, or the white color here I think is close to 30 inches. And many of these areas have seen 20 inches of rain or more. Just to put that in perspective, on average in South Louisiana, we receive every year about 50, 60 inches of rain. So during those 2 days, we've seen 1/3 or 1/2 of what we typically receive in a year. So pretty dramatic, right? And if you, again, NOAA puts out, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and the National Weather Service puts out those maps that shows the frequency of the storms. So this is the same map, but in terms of what we call annual exceedance probability, or what the public know more as a 100-year storm or a 1,000-year storm. And the legend is right there if you can see it. Again, many of these areas have seen, what is called as a 1,000-year storm or a 500-year storm at best. And what's really unique about this storm is not just it's a 1,000-year storm or a 500-year storm, but it's the spatial coverage, right? You can see that this classification is not over a small area or is not over a neighborhood or even a city. It's over a region, right? So that's what makes the storm really dramatic, is that you have this spatial extent with this amount of rain. And another dimension also that made the storm very disastrous is actually the intensity of rain sustained over a long period of time. And I think the next slide here shows, for just a comparison of how our storm, the red line here, that's the storm that we received in the 2016 flood, compares to this 10-year storm and a 50-year storm and a 100-year storm, and the last year is 1,000. There's nothing after that actually because of the lack of data on, what's a 5,000 or 10,000 year storm or have you. But you can see, if you look at 1 hour intensity or a 2 hour intensity or so forth, the storm was not really that bad, right? You can see that the storm could have been easily classified as a 10, maybe a 50 or 100-year storm. It's because of, the fact that the intensity of that rain or how much rain was delivered over this sustained period of time that made the storm very effective and very, it made every part of the catchment of the region contribute to the flood. So every little watershed was actually producing runoff, and that runoff eventually kind of come together and produce this massive flooding that happened over the domain. So it's not really that the label that we put on the storm, it's a lot more than that. And I think, we do injustice maybe as engineers or even as news people or media when we just communicate those numbers about a 10-year or 100-year or 1,000-year storm. The story is a little bit more complicated than that. And the numbers can actually be misleading when you say a 100-year storm. And I think I'll show you an example here that talks about, and I think Pam touched on that. It's really the risk that we need to understand when it comes to communicating what a 1,000-year storm or what's a 100-year storm. And I'll give you an example here about what a 100-year storm really is. I think, we all know that these flood maps and developments are based on the base flood elevation, and if you're not within a 100-year storm, 100-year flood zone, you need to get a flood insurance or not, and so forth. And quite often we look at the 100-year storm and think, okay, that has a chance of 1% happening. So it gives what I believe a full sense of security, really, because 1% is a very small number. It's a chance of having that storm in any given year. That's a fact. That's what it is, really. But if you ask the questions, it's just a little different, and you say, okay, what's the chance of having that storm over a period of 30 years, for example, right? And I picked that period just because that's how typically, house mortgages, are. We live in a house 10, 20, or 30 years. So the question is really what's the chance of having a storm like that, which is going to cause a major flooding over that period? And if you run the statistics, I don't know if anybody here has a statistics background, they can calculate that very quickly. But if you calculate the number, it turns out that over a period of 30 years, right, having a storm of that magnitude at least once is about 26%. So So that's much, much higher than the 1% that people think of, right? So if you live in a house in an area and, what's the chance of getting hit with a 100-year storm? It's actually 26%. And, looking online, I found that this is actually much more, actually it's about 30% more than the risk of a fire at your home. So pretty high risk, that we take by developing in this 100-year flood. And if you run the numbers, for the different return periods, so this is a graph, this is our 26%, that's associated with a 100-year event. If you go, of course, with a 50-year or 25, that's the risk that you're taking, much higher, right? 50% and 70%. But even if you go to a 500-year event, you still have about 6% risk. And I claim that's a pretty high risk to take also, right? And so even if you build outside of that flood zone, you still have that type of risk that you need to plan for. And, I like I said, sometimes I feel like the way we communicate to the public, the risk, that they take developing in these flood areas is not done the right way, when you communicate just the 1%. And even if when you go to a 1,000-year storm, the chance is what? Is 1 out of 1,000. So that's really, but if you run the statistics differently, you have a 3% chance. So that's very different from 1 of 1,000 chance. I guess the same concept you can actually extrapolate over an area also. If you look at about the chance of having a storm of that magnitude over a large area, not too large, but just over an area like in Acadiana, you end up with a percentage that's much higher than 1%. Another issue also that we fail to communicate with the public is how uncertain these numbers are. When we say a 30-inch of rain is a 1,000-year storm, there's a lot of uncertainty associated with that. A lot less rain can be considered as a 1,000-year storm and vice versa. And just to give you a feeling of this, again, what we received during the storm was about 20-something. This is a 2-day statistic, so that's similar to the storm that we had. And we received about, let's say, in many parts in Acadiana here, we received about 20-something, 25. So if you go there to this line here, it's about, close to a 1,000-year storm. But the uncertainty, again, if you have statisticians here in the room, the uncertainty is pretty wide, right? So, again, that's one of the things that I think we fail as engineers or scientists in communicating with the public, not to put doubts in their mind about, that the science or anything, but just to incorporate these facts when they interpret the numbers that a news media is putting out. Where these uncertainties are coming, that's also an important question because it helps us, advise politicians and decision makers and state agencies on investments and improving the science behind these studies. One thing that contributes to the lack of confidence in putting out these numbers is that we don't have enough data, actually, right? And this is a station. This is rainfall records. 24-hour precipitation data that we gathered from a station in Jennings. And here you have about almost a 100-year record. So I grabbed that record and apply it, and I apply what's a 5-year storm, what's a 10-year storm, what's a 25 storm, and 100-year storm. And you can see that that station over the 100-year period did not really witness a 100-year storm, okay? However, we rely on these short periods of short records of data to extrapolate what's a 100-year storm and what's a 1,000-year storm and so forth. Not only we don't have enough long record of data, I guess I'm going to skip that, but how many stations we have, right? How many stations we have in our region that we rely on. Again, I went to the website of the NOAA agency. That's the official agency for putting out rain gauges in the country. And that's what you get in terms of coverage for the entire U.S. And it's pretty impressive. It looks like very dense coverage. But if you zoom in onto our region and you find this, right? So very sparse coverage, very sparse coverage. And actually, a lot of these gauges are not functional. They have either stopped, because of lack of funding or because of logistic issues and so forth. And I'm not saying this is unique to our region, but actually it is a little exaggerated here that it's very pronounced in this southwest Louisiana that we don't have enough coverage of gauges, right? The situation is not a whole lot better in other parts of the country, but it's just giving you an idea of how much gaps we have in our data. And the data drives the scientific analysis, it drives the models that we use, and it drives the decisions that we make at the end. So, it's just a follow-up on what the previous panel said, that investments in data and gathering data is something that we need to make as community to be able to improve how we can make our decisions. I'm going to run through this quickly. I don't know how am I doing with the time. Still okay? Okay. So another thought here also, people think, okay, this was just a very rare event. It never happened before. I have not seen it before. And that's not really true. If you run a simple Google search, Mr. Cormier said that, he lived through 400-year events, very recently. If you run a simple Google search, you'll find over the last maybe year or two, over the U.S., there were like several, maybe 8 or 9 storms that were classified as a 500-year, 1,000-year storm. So it's not really a rare event. I mean, it is a rare event, but it's going to happen again. Hopefully, not with this devastating impact, but this magnitude of storm is happening and is being, recorded more often. As a matter of fact, I was searching online. I didn't live here in Louisiana long enough to remember what happened in 1980, but I was looking for information about own floods, and I used some simple search word like Amit and Comet River and, flooding and so forth, and I came across this article that was published just a couple years before our storm, and it was talking about this devastating flood of Livingston and East Baton Rouge Parish in 1983. And if you read the article, it's very similar to what happened in August 2016 in terms of the impact of the storm and so forth. So it's just happening probably more often. The impact, because of the development that we have, is becoming more dramatic, right? Maybe the same type of storm, but because of the urban development that happened, now the impact is much more noticeable. Another question, is can also, miscommunicated to the public is whether, a 100-year storm is corresponding to a 100-year flood. And that's not really the case, actually. You can have several of these 100-year storms, but the impact in terms of flooding will depend on many factors. Where the storm is, was it located here or was it located here, And I'm sure if that storm just moved up a little bit, the impact on the flooding would have been a lot, worse in these areas which were not impacted as bad. And another component also is, the urban development. Like I said, the same storm, if you put it in a developed area versus an undeveloped area, the impact will be very, very different. I'm going to share with you here also some interesting, kind of story about the flood here that impacted in Baton Rouge that just communicates the impact of that development on how, the flooding can occur. Probably have seen this story. It's on the news. This was earlier this year about a lawsuit for I-12, and what you see here is this median wall on I-12. This is the westbound, I think. This is looking north this way. And, this wall was built for, highway safety, but during the flood, it acted as a flood wall, actually, right? And it caused, stopped the water from draining this way. And like I said, when I looked at that article in 83, they were talking about the same issue, that this wall also, that wall did the same thing in 83 that it did here. And, of course, you start, playing, these blame games, who's responsible, what have you. But, there's also another side of the story. You can do a very simple comparison in terms of to look at how fast the urban development have happened over the last few years. And I'm comparing here, you can do this from Google Earth, actually, right? You can scroll back and forth in time and look at how land cover and land use have changed. I compared here these two maps from 1983 to 2016. And, this is the Denham Spring, this is I-12. And you can just compare. The white color means more urban development, right? And you can see just how much urban development happened over the years. And, people knew about I-12 problem or whatever you call it. People knew about the floods, but as communities, we still, decided to develop without really, looking at the problem from a larger perspective. Whether if you do a small development here or small development here, maybe on its own, it doesn't do a whole lot of damage. But when you put these things together and you get this kind of storm, well, the result is all what we have seen in the August. I'm going to close here with a few slides on the type of research that we do here at UL. I'm a professor at the university, and we have an active research program in flood modeling and monitoring and analysis. And I'm personally excited about the timing. It's a sad time to see all the impacts that happen and the damage, but it's also an exciting time to see how the community is coming together, the state agencies, the municipalities, the parishes, and the academia, and all the community resources. And I acknowledge here my colleague Robert Miller. He's sitting right there. He's with us in the Civil Engineering Department, and we are also part of the Institute of Coastal and Water Research. I think Ed Terrio, probably he left. And in that department and institute, we run a suite of models and data analysis. Our analysis can, scan different scales from a regional scale all the way to a catchment scale. And what we try to do is to build models associated with hydrologic analysis to be able to predict what's going to happen in the next storm. Maybe look at a proposed solution and see pre and post development, if that development will actually increase their likelihood of floods, or maybe advice on what you can do in terms of detention basins or mitigation strategies and where to put them and how much benefit you can get out of them. So I'm going to scroll very quickly. These are some examples of the models that we have. Some of them are very local scale. We call them a street level modeling. And some of them are regional. And again, I iterate what my previous panelists said on the need for that regional approach. You cannot just focus on a neighborhood or a development or a town. You have to look at the watershed in its entirety, because with these large floods, everything starts to communicate. There is all sorts of applications. You can start to delineate the floodplain. You can look at how much during a 100-year flood, or actually this last flood, how much the extent of the flood, how long it will stay. And like I said, if you put a detention basin, or if you put a mitigation project, will you be able to reduce the flooding here? These are the questions that you can actually answer with these types of models. This is an example, that my colleague here, Robert, produced to show how different basins during an extreme flood actually cross over and they become one large basin. This is the Cooley Mean. We're all familiar with it. It runs here in town. Cooley Eldecan, which is not too far from there. These are two separate watersheds, if you can think about it that way. But during a flood, they cross over and water starts to go back and forth between the two. So another justification of why we need that regional approach. Again, with the models here, you can go down to the stream level, analysis, and you can run the models in retrospective. Hopefully, we can do that in real time also, and you can look at, streets as they flood, right? Of course, this is a very computationally expensive model. However, we hope that with the advances that are happening with the cloud simulations and so forth, we can actually make something like that run in real time and produce information to the public, maybe warnings or guidances or what have you. Like I said, this is one of the efforts that we are trying to start here. This is my last slide. Basically, we are trying to develop a pilot effort in one of the catchments here in South Louisiana. This is Cooley Mean. And what we want to do is to test that high-performance computing modeling power merged with smart sensors, right, that you can deploy at a relatively cheap cost and without really intruding into the water itself. A lot of these sensors can actually sit on bridges, or you can mount them underneath the bridges so you don't have to put them in the water. And we want to couple that with high speed, with high performance computer models to be able to forecast the rainfall and the floods as they occur, and hopefully share them through a cloud system where they can be broadcast over the internet or hopefully over the iPhones or what have you. And like I said, we are doing this. A university by itself cannot do it. You are doing that with collaboration. We hope to do that with a collaboration with the city, with the parish, and private industry who can help us with some of the technologies. And also we're trying to engage with the local community foundations, schools, to add an outreach or education component with it. And so this is just an effort that we are starting recently, and hopefully we'll be able to push it forward with resources from the community. I think that's my last slide. I'm sorry if I went over time, and I'll give it to the next panelist.
I'm going to ask Mark Dubrock to come up. I think this is a question for the entire panel, and it might be a little unfair to ask Mark, put him on the spot to answer it, but as a way of wrapping up, there's a lot of data sets out there, a lot of deferred maintenance that's associated with some of our coulees. Guy alluded to the primary problem in the watershed being here, located here in Lafayette. So what's the roadmap look like as far as identifying the specific projects and the order of the projects, and what is the timeline looking like?
Well, that does indeed put me on the spot. I'm new at this job. I interviewed and accepted the job in the middle of July. I was, prior to that, a private practitioner, much like Pamela. But I've lived in this community my whole life, so I was motivated, I think, to try to wrap up my engineering career and hopefully give something back to this community that I've lived in my entire life. And through my personal experiences and hard times in life, have come to love the people of Acadiana, the character of our society. And we see that a lot with people who move into our community. Maybe some of you indeed came from outside, and people move into our community and love it, and they love the people, and they love the culture. And I think in my mind as an engineer, I wanted to see or take on the challenge of seeing if we can make our infrastructure reflect the character of our people. And I love the phrase they're using in these watershed studies of resiliency, because I think of anything, our people traditionally and today are resilient people. The events of last year are a flood, an experience of a flood that we're hopefully never going to see again in our life. I don't think anybody saw anything prior to that. They say that perhaps in 1940 the water got as high on the Vermilion, but certainly we didn't have the population that we have now, and so the impact of that flood was nothing compared to this event. And so I think that's the difference between a 100-year rainfall and a 100-year flood. I do think the magnitude of the storm was such that we will hopefully never see that again. In coming into this job, I find that as a community and as a parish, we have not been able to keep up with the channel clearing and those efforts that on a very, very local level in the small watersheds, that's the critical obstacle that people see as causing them to flood. But the situation is much greater than that, because cleaning those channels may solve a problem in a few residences on that channel, or maybe many residences on that channel, but the water that is in that channel causing that flooding needs to go someplace. And the only place it can go is into the Vermilion. And from the Vermilion, it can only go into Vermilion Parish. And if you look at aerial photos of Abbeville on August 12th, of 2016, there was no room for water in Abbeville. They had houses with water to their eaves from the Vermilion River. And so we can't just dump that water into our neighboring parishes. I think in the case of St. Martin Parish, we saw the backflow of the Vermilion going into the Lake Martin water swamp area. And after a period of time, well, that swamp had no more storage capacity, and so it flowed out over into Guy's Parish. And those people dealt with a lot of water that didn't fall on their community, but it fell in the watershed. And so I think Guy's recognition that we're all interrelated is a true fact. And I think what the parish presidents are doing is an admirable approach to trying to solve or at least remediate some of the dangers that we face. We're never going to be able to protect everybody in this parish or this watershed from an event of last year. The only solution to that would be identify all of those homes below whatever elevations on the flood maps and relocate them or raise them above the base flood elevation. So the answer is to try to just make improvements in the systems that we have, being aware of where that water is going to go. And so the answer that any engineer will tell you, there's only one answer to that in this area, is going to be detention. And that's going to be large regional detention facilities on the main channels. And the main channels I refer to are the channels like Ilda Khan and Isaac Vero, and those large coulees that drain significantly large areas of the parish. We do not have plans in hand to do that. That needs to come out of this event, and we'll have to prioritize that and try to generate funding for those projects. The $30 million at $25 million or $30 million, as you can look at it in different ways, we need a couple of more zeros at the end of that in the big picture. And that money is not identified. It's not on the table, but that's what it's going to take to start attempting to address some of these problems. We're working right now to try to prioritize channels that need cleaning. Mayor Robideau has recently brought forth the initiative to reallocate some millages that were underutilized for the health unit and the animal shelter, animal control, I should say, and try to reallocate some of those millages into drainage. And that would effectively double from about $7 million a year to somewhere but about $12 million a year, with an initial, actually a fairly substantial initial lump sum of about $10 million. And so if that endeavor or initiative passes, it has to go to the public. It was also approved by the city council, the parish council, the consolidated parish council. It was approved last week, and so it will go to the electorate in November, and hopefully that millage initiative will pass, and we'll have a little bit of money to deal with some of the more routine clearing and snagging of the channels. That's not going to solve our problem, but it's going to help in smaller areas and in the local areas, I should say, and perhaps prevent some flooding in local events. It's not an easy task, and we're moving forward with it. I don't have a specific time frame. It is after we get past this budget session this next couple of weeks. My department's sole priority will be to formulate a plan, a prioritization of these projects, identification of the projects, prioritization of the projects, and then perhaps we can talk about additional funds for the large projects. So it's a difficult problem. It's a problem of our community. And I think one of the comments was made that it's the government's responsibility to do this or do that. But in America, we are the government. And so each and every one of us has an obligation to be involved and know what the government is doing, because the government is doing what we've told the government to do, or what we have failed to tell the government to do. So my other task is to educate the public and the council and the administration on this priorities or this prioritization of these works, and see what it takes. And it's going to always come down. Somebody said, well, there's no system can handle that. Well, that system to handle it could be designed, but in general, there's nobody to pay for something of that magnitude. So you're always making choices, you're making decisions, and we as a community make those decisions. But until we have good information and some prioritization based on good science and good economics, we can't make that decision. So my priority is to get that information to you and to the council and to the administration. It's not all doom and gloom. We're not going to have these events every day. One of the things, we get complaints every time it rains. We were inundated with calls today of my street's flooded, my ditch was full of water. Well, that's good. We want the water in the ditch and we want it in the streets. And you may be out of, you may need to sit tight for an hour or an hour and a half while the street drains out, but that's the purpose of that system. And so knowing what's happening is something that you need to be cognizant of and make yourself aware of how the system works. So all the water that's in the street and in the ditches is not in your house, and that's our priority. The other thing I was thinking was that Guy was talking about, he's had 4 or 5 instances of the 100-year storm in his tenure, and he thinks he might be 450 years old. And I had a story a long time ago, back in the 80s, was a city councilman in a meeting saying, well, 100-year storm, 100-year storm. I've heard that, I've had the 100-year storm 3 times since I'm in office, and it's really simple. He was just in office too long. But, that's the statistics and the numbers don't reflect the reality of the event. And I think many of us here have a personal story. And, I moved a very good friend of mine, had a 2-story home on the Vermilion River, very nice home. He was a collector. He and his wife collected all sorts of things. His dad was a barber, and he had this fantastic collection of shaving kits going back to the 1700s, a couple of them. And on Saturday morning, we were in his house wading through, knee-deep water and carrying as much of his treasures to the 2nd floor as we could to save that. And you don't realize the trauma of that until you experience it. And so my message to my staff is always that we have to listen to the complaints and take them into account and be compassionate about the responses that we give. And I think that these men and women that I'm working or trying to lead have done a superb job of that in the last year, to the point where that many of them are somewhat traumatized by the repetitive message that they can't solve all the problems. And so I'm hoping that in the next few months we can make some real headway into solving some of those problems. So with that said, you want to take questions?
Sure. Are we done?
Did you want to do, I don't know if you have time, I don't know.
No, I think in the interest of time, simply because we do have the keynote right at 6 p.m., we are not going to do questions, and instead give you this opportunity to come up and talk to them afterwards in that time between now and the keynote. Sorry, all, if you want to stick around after and ask them questions, they'll be here. So thank you to our panelists for wrapping up what I think is a very fitting conclusion on our day's discussion of Louisiana and water, our relationship to it, how we live with it, and how we cope with it, how do we plan for it in the future. Before we break for dinner, well, first, round of applause to the panel here. So before we break for dinner and later our keynote address, we do have one more thing on the agenda. And for that, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Michael Martin, who is the head of the Center for Louisiana Studies, which did plan this program for you.
Is this on? No, it's off. Is this on? This is on. Okay, so this afternoon we've heard a lot about policy, a lot about politics, quite a bit of rather depressing information, some statistics. But I thought what we should do as we prepare for this extended break before the keynote is have a moment for some contemplation. And what better person to lead us in a moment of contemplation than a poet? So it's my pleasure to introduce Darrell Bork, who is Professor Emeritus in English at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. He is a former 2-term Poet Laureate of the state of Louisiana. He has won numerous awards, including national awards for his collections of poetry. He was the 2014 recipient of the Louisiana Writer Award given by the Louisiana Center for the Book. That was in recognition for outstanding contributions to Louisiana's literary and intellectual life. And in 2015, he received the James Williams Rivers Prize in Louisiana Studies, which is awarded by the Center for Louisiana Studies in UL Lafayette to honor persons who have contributed recently or over the course of their careers outstanding work on the fields of Louisiana and its peoples. And so with no further ado, I will hand it over to Darrell Bork.
Yeah, this one works. Thank you very much, Michael. This has really been an exciting day, and I don't think it's redundant at all to point out the efforts of Liz Skilton and Michael Martin and Jennifer Ritter-Guidry for bringing architects and policymakers and attorneys and fable writers and engineers and musicologists in a conversation about water. All day long we've been talking about water, and I would like to speak in the voice of water. On August the 29th, 2016, I began to think about what was coming to me from Rob Perillo and the national media, which didn't so much cover what we were undergoing at the time, about what we heard mentioned today: water as a threat, water in our survival, water as a sacred element. And so I thought just briefly we should make a space for water itself to speak in the spirit of the kind of symposia that always is part of how to handle huge problems that we face as communities and the problems that we face as a civilization. This little prose poem is called The Dialectics of Water. I have nothing against banks or levees or towns or developers. I have nothing against engineers or contractors and dreams. I have no political agenda. You know Tangipahoa and Mermentau and Amite and the lovely people of Denham Springs. But I am water, and do not know in the ways you know. I will go wherever I have to go, will do whatever I have to do. There should be no blame for what cannot be blamed. I am in your skies. I am just under the surface you call solid ground. We live together in this place. I am in the oldest stories you tell, in the paintings you have to paint. One day, you separated from me and began your life on a mound, not me. And then you began to name things: Vermilion, Defuncta, Bogachito. You called places Tikfa, Calcasieu, and Plaquemine Brûlée, Chitamacha, and Atchafalaya, and Tesh. Most of what you are, I am. I inundate, I gush, I overflow and move into places. I am in your songs. I am your basin, your delta, your backwater, your swamp, your marsh. I am your beginning and your end. Thank you.